brought to you by BunnySlippers.com. Check out their brand new Dino sound slippers. Slippers make a roaring sound every 3 steps. Made with green scaly fabric, soft plush uppers, foam footbeds, non-slip grips on soles, and 3 white claws on each foot. One size fits most up to women's 10.5, men's 9. Footbed measures 10.5. Black Clock Audio Tales is a daily podcast that reads you a story, either a chapter of a novel or a whole short story. Join us in our exploration of old ghost stories, supernatural fiction, horror tales, folk tales, fantasy, gothic horror, weird fiction, and cosmic horror. And don't forget to join us for our monthly show about the Cthulhu Mythos. Look for our podcast near the old wishing well in the blasted heath, wherever you find your podcasts. We suggest Podbean or Apple Podcasts. Find us on the web at pgttcm.com and at Black Clock Audio on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and Black Clock Audio Tales on YouTube. Welcome to Black Clock Audio Tales. Check out our new website over at www.pgttcm.com. Edited by Daniel Spitzer, music by Kevin MacLeod. The Chamber, Oppressive Gloom, Despair. Welcome to Part 1, Folklore of Great Britain.
Join us at the end of the month when we talk about the great old ones.
Chapter 22. The Red Bandits of Montgomery. When chimneys were first added to houses in Wales, and the style of house building changed from round to square, many old people found fault with the new fashion of letting the smoke out. They declared they caught colds and sneezed oftener than in the times gone by. The chimneys, they said, cost too much money, and were useless extravagances. They got along well enough in the good old days, when the smoke had its own way of getting out. Then it took plenty of time to pass through the doors and wind-holes, for no one person or thing was in a hurry when they were young. Moreover, when the fireplace was in the middle of the floor, the whole family sat around it and had a sociable time. It was true, as they confessed, when argued with, that the smell of the cooking used to linger too long. The soot also hung in long streamers from the rafters, and stuck to the house like old friends. But the greatest and most practical objection of the old folks to the chimneys was that robbers used them to climb down at night and steal people's money when they were asleep. So many householders used to set old scythe blades across the new smoke holes to keep out the thieves, or to slice them up if they persisted. In Montgomery, which is one of the Welsh shires, there was an epidemic of robbery, and the doings of the Red Bandits are famous in history. Now there was a young widow whose husband had been killed by the footbeds, or road robbers. She was left alone in the world, with a little boy baby in the cradle and only one cow in the byre. She had hard work to pay her rent, but as there were 3 or 4 scythes set in the chimney, and the cow stable had a good lock on it, she thought she was safe from burglars or common thieves. But the Reds picked out the most expert chimney climber in their gang, and he one night slipped down into the widow's cottage without making any noise or cutting off his nose, toes, or fingers. Then, robbing the widow of her rent money, he picked the lock of the byre and drove off the cow. In the morning the poor woman found both doors open, but there was no money and no cow. While she was crying over her loss and wringing her hands because of her poverty, she heard a knock at the door. "Come in," said the widow. There entered an old lady with a kindly face. She was very tall and well dressed. Her cloak, her gloves and shoes, and the ruffles under her high-peaked Welsh headdress were all green. The widow thought she looked like an animated leek. In her right hand was a long staff, and in her left, under her cloak, she held a little bag that was green also. "Why do you weep?" asked the visitor. Then the widow told her tale of woe, the story of the loss of her husband, and how a red robber, in spite of the scythe blades set in the chimney, had come down and taken away both her money and her cow. Now, although she had sold all her butter and cream, she could neither pay her rent nor have any buttermilk with her rye bread and flummery. "Dry your tears and take comfort," said the tall lady in the green peaked hat. Here is money enough to pay your rent and buy another cow." With that she sat down at the round table near the peat fire. Opening her bag, the shining gold coins slid out and formed a little heap on the table. "There, you can have all this, if you will give me all I want." At first the widow's eyes opened wide, and then she glanced at the cradle, where her baby was sleeping. Then she wondered, though she said nothing. But the next moment she was laughing at herself and looking around at her poor cottage. She tried to guess what there was in it that the old lady could possibly want. "You can have anything I have. Name it," she said cheerfully to her visitor. But only a moment more, and all her fears returned at the thought that the visitor might ask for her boy. The old lady spoke again and said, "I want to help you all I can, but what I came here for is to get the little boy in the cradle." The widow now saw that the old woman was a fairy, and that if her visitor got hold of her son, she would never see her child again. So she begged piteously of the old lady to take anything and everything except her one child. "No, I want that boy, and if you want the gold, you must let me take him." "Is there anything else that I can do for you, so that I might get the money?" asked the widow. "Well, I'll make it easier for you. There are 2 things I must tell you to cheer you." "What are they?" asked the widow eagerly. "One is that by our fairy law I cannot take your boy until 3 days have passed. Then I shall come again, and you shall have the gold, but only on the one condition I have stated." "And the next?" almost gasped the widow. "If you can guess my name, you will doubly win, for then I shall give you the gold and you can keep your boy." Without waiting for another word, the lady in green scooped up her money, put it back in the bag, and moved off and out the door. The poor woman, at once a widow and mother, and now stripped of her property, fearing to lose her boy, brooded all night over her troubles and never slept a wink. In the morning she rose up, left her baby with a neighbor, and went to visit some relatives in the next village, which was several miles distant. She told her story, but her kinsfolk were too poor to help her, so, all disconsolate, she turned her face homeward. On her way back she had to pass through the woods, where on one side was a clearing. In the middle of this open space was a ring of grass. In the ring a little fairy lady was tripping around and singing to herself. Creeping up silently, the anxious mother heard to her joy a rhymed couplet, and caught the sound of a name, several times repeated. It sounded like "silly doot." Hurrying home and perfectly sure that she knew the secret that would save her boy, she set cheerily about her regular work and daily tasks. In fact, she slept soundly that night. Next day in came the lady in green as before, with her bag of money. Taking her seat at the round table, near the fire, she poured out the gold. Then jingling the coins in the pile, she said, "Now give up your boy, or guess my name, if you want me to help you." The young widow, feeling sure that she had the old fairy in a trap, thought she would have some fun first. "How many guesses am I allowed?" she asked. "All you want, and as many as you please," answered the green lady, smiling. The widow rattled off a string of names, English, Welsh, and Biblical, but every time the fairy shook her head. Her eyes began to gleam, as if she felt certain of getting the boy. She even moved her chair around to the side nearest the cradle. "One more guess," cried the widow. "Can it be silly doot?" At this sound the fairy turned red with rage. At the same moment the door opened wide, and a blast of wind made the hearth fire flare up. Leaving her gold behind her, the old woman flew up the chimney and disappeared over the housetops. The widow scooped up the gold, bought 2 cows, furnished her cottage with new chairs and fresh flowers, and put the rest of the coins away under one of the flagstones at the hearth. When her boy grew up, she gave him a good education, and he became one of the fearless judges, who, with the aid of Baron Owen, rooted out of their lair the red bandits that had robbed his mother. Since that day there has been little crime in Wales, the best governed part of the kingdom. End of The Red Bandits of Montgomery.
Recording by Betty B. Welsh Fairy Tales by William Elliot Griffiths. Chapter 23. The Fairy Congress. One can hardly think of Wales without a harp. The music of this most ancient and honourable instrument, which emits sweet sounds when heard in a foreign land, makes Welsh folks homesick for the old country and the music of the harp. Its strings can wail with woe, ripple with merriment, sound out the notes of war and peace, and lift the soul in heavenly melody. Usually a player on the harp opened the Eisteddfod, as the Welsh Literary Congress is called, but this time they had engaged for the fairies a funny little fellow to start the program with a solo on his violin. The figure of this musician at the Congress of Welsh Fairies was the most comical of any in the company. The saying that he was popular with all the mountain spirits was shown to be true, the moment he began to scrape his fiddle, for then they all crowded around him. "Did you ever see such a tiny specimen?" asked Queen Mab of Puck. The little fiddler came forward, and drawing his instrument from under his arm, proceeded to scrape the strings. He had on a pair of moss trousers, and his coat was a yellow gorse flower. His feet were clad in shoes made of beetles' wings, which always kept bright, as if polished with a brush. When one looked at the fiddle, he could see that it was only a wooden spoon, with strings across the bowl. But the moment he drew the bow from one side to the other, all the elves, from every part of the hills, came tripping along to hear the music, and at once began dancing. Some of these elves were dressed in pink, some in blue, others in yellow, and many had glowworms in their hands. Their tread was so light that the flower stems never bent, nor was a petal crushed when they walked over the turf. All, as they came near, bowed or dropped a curtsy. Then the little musician took off his cap to each, and bowed in return. There was too much business before the meeting for dancing to be kept up very long, but when the violin solo was over, at a sign given by the fiddler, the dancers took seats wherever they could find them, on the grass, or gorse, or heather, or on the stones. After order had been secured, the chairman of the meeting read regrets from those who had been invited but could not be present. The first note was from the mermaids, who lived near the green isles of the ocean. They asked to be excused from traveling inland and climbing rocks. In the present delicate state of their health, this would be too fatiguing, poor things. It was unanimously voted that they be excused. Queen Mab was dressed, as befitted the occasion, like a Welsh lady, not wearing a crown, but a high-peaked hat, pointed at the top, and about half a yard high. It was black, and was held on by fastenings of scalloped lace that came down around her neck. The lake fairies, or elfin maids, were out in full force. These lived at the bottom of the many ponds and pools in Wales. Many stories are told of the wonderful things they did with boats and cattle. Nowadays, when they milk cows by electric machinery and use steam launches on the water, most of the water sprites of all kinds have been driven away, for they do not like the smell of kerosene or gasoline. It is for these reasons that in our day they are not often seen. In fact, cows from the creameries can wade out into the water and even stand in it while lashing their tails to keep off the flies, without any danger, as in old times, of being pulled down by the elfin maids. The little red men that could hide under a thimble and have plenty of room to spare were all out. The elves and nixies and sprites of all colors and many forms were on hand. The pygmies, who guard the palace of the King of the World underground, came in their gay dresses. There were 3 of them, and they brought in their hands balls of gold with which to play tenpins, but they were not allowed to have any games while the meeting was going on. In fact, just when these little fellows from down under the earth were showing off their gay clothes and their treasures from the caves, one mischievous fairy maid sidled up to their chief and whispered in his ear, "Better put away your gold, for this is in modern Wales, where they have pawn shops. 3 golden balls, 2 above the one below, which you often see nowadays, means that 2 to 1 you will never get it again. These hang out as the sign of a pawnbroker's shop, and what you put in does not, as a rule, come out. I am afraid that some of the Cymric fairies from Cornwall, or Montgomery, or Cheshire might think you were after business, and you understand that no advertising is allowed here." In a moment, each of the 3 leaders thrust his ball into his bosom. It made his coat bulge out, and at this some of the fairies wondered, but all they thought of was that this spoiled a handsome fellow's figure. Or was it some new idea? To tell the truth, they were vexed at not keeping up with the new fashions, for they knew nothing of this latest fad among such fine young gallants. Much of the chat and gossip before and after the meeting was between the fairies who live in the air or on mountains and those down in the earth or deep in the sea. They swapped news, gossip, and scandal at a great rate. There were a dozen or 2 fine-looking creatures who had high brows, who said they were co-eds. This did not mean that these fairies had ever been through college. "Certainly the college never went through them," said one very homely fairy, who was spiteful and jealous. The simple fact was that the one they called Betty the co-ed, and others from that Welsh village called Bryn Mawr, and another from Flint, and another from Yale, and still others from Brimbo, and from co-ed Powys, had come from places so named and down on the map of Wales, though there were no real co-ed girls there that could talk French, or English, or read Latin. In fact, co-ed simply meant that they were from the woods and lived among the trees, for co-ed in Welsh means a forest. The fairy police were further instructed not to admit, and, if such were found, to put out the following bad characters, for this was a perfectly respectable meeting. These naughty folks were: the old hag of the mist, the invisible hag that moans dolefully in the night, the toleth, a creature never seen, but that groans, sings, saws, or stamps noisily, the dogs of the sky, all witches of every sort and kind, all peddlers of horseshoes, crosses, charms, or amulets, all mortals with brains fuddled by liquor, all who had on shoes which water would not run under, all fairies that were accustomed to turn mortals into cheese. Every one of these who might want to get in were to be refused admittance. Another circle of rather exclusive fairies, who always kept away from the blacksmiths, hardware stores, smelting furnaces, and mines, had formed an anti-iron society. These were a kind of Welsh 400, or elite, who would have nothing to do with anyone who had an iron tool or weapon or ornament in his hand, or on his dress, or who used iron in any form or for any use. They frowned upon the idea of Cymric land becoming rich by mining and smelting and selling iron. They did not even approve of the idea that any imps and dwarfs of the iron mines should be admitted to the meeting. One clique of fairies that looked like elves were in bad humor, almost to moping. When one of these got up to speak, it seemed as if he would never sit down. He tired all the lively fairies by long-winded reminiscences of druids and mistletoes, and by telling everyone how much better the old times were than the present. President Puck, who always liked things short, and was himself as lively as Quicksilver, many times called these long-winded fellows to order, but they kept meandering on until daybreak, when it was time to adjourn, lest the sunshine should spoil them all and change them into slate or stone. It was hard to tell just how much business was disposed of at this session, or whether one ever came to the point, although there was a great deal of oratory and music, much of what was said in poetry or in verses or rhymes of 3 lines each. What they talked about was mainly in protest against the smoke of factories and collieries, and because there was so much soot and so little soap in the land. But what did they do at the Fairy Congress? The truth is that nobody today knows what was done in this session of the fairies, for the proceedings were kept secret. The only one who knows was an old Welshman whom the storyteller used to meet once in a while. He is the one mortal who knows anything about this meeting, and he won't tell, or at least he won't talk in anything but Welsh, so we have to find out the gist of the matter by noticing in the stories which we have just read what the fairies did.
Welsh Fairy Tales by William Elliot Griffiths. Chapter 24. The Sword of Avalon. Many of the Welsh tales are about fightings and wars, and no country as small as Wales has so many castles. Yet these are nearly all ruins and children play in them. This is because men got tired in battles and sieges. Everyone knows that after King Arthur's knights had punched and speared, whacked and chopped each other with axes and swords long enough, had slain dragons and tamed monsters, and rescued princesses from cruel uncles, and good men from dark dungeons, even the plain people, such as farmers and mechanics, had enough and wanted no more. Besides this, they wished to be treated more like human beings, and not to have to work so hard, and also to keep their money when they earned it. Even King Arthur himself, towards the end of this era, saw that fashions were changing and that he must change with them. Hardware was too high in price, and was no longer needed for clothing. He was wise enough to see that battle axes, maces, swords, lances, and armour had better be put to some better use, when iron was getting scarce and wool and linen was cheaper. Even the stupid Normans learnt that decency and kindness cost less, and accomplished more by making the Welshry loyal subjects of the king. So when, after many battles, King Arthur went to have a little war of his own, and to enjoy the fight, in which he was mortally wounded, he showed his greatness, even in his hour of death. In truth, it is given to some men, like Samson, that they might be mightier when they die, than when following the strenuous life. So it was with this great and good man of Cymru. His love for the people never ceased for one moment, and in his dying hour he left a bequest that all his good people have understood and acted upon. Thus it has come to pass that the Welsh have really been unconquerable by Normans and Saxons, and even in the 20th century days of Teutons. Though living in such a small country, they are the greatest in the world, not in force or material things, but in soul. When Belgium was invaded, they not only stood in battle against the invader, but they welcomed to their homes tens of thousands of fugitives, and fed and sheltered them. Brave as lions, their path of progress has been in faithfulness, in duty and industry, and patience, and among the paths of poetry, music, and brotherhood. Their motto for ages has been truth against the world. Now the manner of King Arthur's taking off and his immortal legacy was on this fashion. After doing so many wonderful great things in many countries, King Arthur came back to punish the wicked man, Modred. In the battle that ensued, he received wounds that made him feel as if he was going to die soon. So he ordered his loyal vassal to take his swords to the islands of Avalon. There he must cast the weapon into the deep water. But the sword was a part of the soul of Arthur. It would not sink out of sight until it had given a message from the king to the Welsh for all time. After it had been thrown into the water, it disappeared, but rose again. First the shining blade, then the hilt, then the hand was seen to rise out of the flood. Thrice that hand waved the sword round and round. This was the prophecy of the deathless from the dead. King Arthur's body might be hidden in a cave or moulded in the ground, but his soul was to live and cheer on his people. His beloved Cymric nation, with their undying language, were to rise to power again. And the resurgence has been glorious, not by the might of the soldier, or by arms or war, though the Welsh never flinched from duty or before the foe, but the power of the poet, singer, and narrator of stories that touch the imagination and fire the soul to noble deeds have these results come. Arthur's good blade, thus waved above the water, became a veritable sword of the spirit. Men of genius arose to flush with colour the old legends. Prophets, preachers, monks, missionaries carried all over Europe, and made them the vehicles of Christian doctrine. In their new forms they fired the imagination and illuminated, as with 10,000 lamps, many lands and nations, until they held every people in spell. In miracle and morality play, they reappeared in beauty. They attuned the harp and the instrument of the musician and troubadour, and these sang the Gospels in all lands, north and south, while telling the stories of Adam and of Abraham, of Bethlehem, and of the cross, of the Holy Grail, and of Arthur and his knights. All of the precious lore of the Celtic race became transfigured to illuminate and enforce Christian truth. The spiritual bowl, the Celtic cauldron of abundance, became the cup of the Eucharist, and the Grail, the symbol of blessings eternal. By the artists, in the stained glass, and in the windows of the great churches, which were built no longer of wood but of stone, that blossomed under the chisel. The old legends were, by the currents of truth, given a mystic glow. As wonderful as the rise of Gothic architecture and the upbuilding of cathedrals, as glorious as the light and art that beautified the great temples of worship, was this rebirth to the Arthurian legends. For now, again, the old virtues of the knightly days, loyalty, obedience, redress of wrongs, reverence of womanhood, and the application of Christian ethics to the old rude rules of decency, lift the life of the common people to a nobler plane and ushered in modern days. Then, after 700 years, a host of singers, Tennyson leading them all, attuned to the old Celtic harp. They reset us to the Cymric melody and colourful incident in The Light That Never Was on Sea or Land. The old days live again in greater glory. Lady Guest put the Mabinogion into English, and Rennant, and Arnold, and Rolleston, and Rhys, in prose, completed the praise of heritages from the old time. Popular education was diffused. The Welsh language rose again from the dead. Cardiff holds, in pure white marble, the most thrilling interpretation of Welsh history in the 12 marble statues of the great men of Wales. The Welsh people, by bloodless victory, have won the respect of all mankind. They set the beacon up for in the World War of 1914 to 1918, they helped to save freedom and civilization. They were in the van. Long may the sword of Arthur wave. End of chapter 24. End of Welsh Fairy Tales by William Elliot Griffiths.